Okay, so good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to yet another very well attended session brought to you by the Linen Hall Library. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge that this event has been supported financially this evening by the Arts Council's Emergency Fund, which has helped the Linen Hall Library make the transition to online programming during our period of prolonged closure. However, as well as receiving support from public money, we are also reliant on support from the general public, and that is where you guys come in, because for as little of a price of a pint of beer per month, you could become a member of the Linen Hall Library and help preserve this unique institution which has existed since 1788. If this is something which is of interest to you, to become a member of the Linen Hall Library, it doesn't cost very much at all. Do try and make contact with me at the end of the session or email me afterwards, and I can certainly point you in the right direction. But back to tonight. It was around this time last year that I attended an open mic session by the Thomas Carnduff Society at the Eastside Visitor Centre of the Newtownards Road in East Belfast. The primary speaker that night was Dr. Connal Parr. I think I'd met him before, but it was certainly the first time that I'd heard him speak, and he was hugely impressive. And I'm glad that you will all have an opportunity tonight then to hear him too. Following Connal's talk, I'll take the chair again and invite four individuals from the Thomas Carnduff Society to share some brief contributions with us. If at any point during Connal's presentation or the contributions at the end, you have a question or a comment, I would encourage you to please submit it using the chat function. And the reason why we do that is so that we don't have 50 people trying to shout over the top of each other, because it really just isn't going to work. So if you can open the chat function, you can put any questions or comments. I'll be monitoring that during the session. And then at the end, I'll pick those up and then I can field those to Connal or to any of the contributors. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Connal to unmute himself, and I'm going to hand over to Connal, who's going to take us for the next 20 to 30 minutes. Okay.
Thanks very much for that, Jason, and to the Linen Hall for hosting this as well. It's also really nice to be reunited with regulars from the Thomas Carnduff Society, who I met for the first time back in March before the pandemic paused everything. And there I can see some other familiar faces besides that as well, and various things. And also I wanted to begin by saying that the Linen Hall is actually a very appropriate virtual host for this event, because Carnduff was the caretaker of the library from 1951 until 1954 at the end of his life. And I'll say a little bit more about that towards the end. While we were trailing this event, I wrote an article on Carnduff for the Belfast newsletter, which was published about a week ago, where I pitched him as a good profile for the centenary of Northern Ireland. Now, partly that was just to do with getting a hook to get some interest, but I stand over the assertion that you could do worse than look at Thomas Carnduff if you want to capture all the shades of complexity that make up Northern Ireland. The Northern Ireland office chose Seamus Heaney as its literary face in the end, to amidst hackles recently, and some people will remember some of the controversy around that. But as I argued in the piece, Carnduff had such a varied life and took in so much rich history that I think there's something in it. And above all, it's this way that Carnduff's identity is complex. He's multiple different things: shipyardman, Irish, Orange man, unionist, writer, and above all, working class. So you're in for quite the life now. So here's what you get. Carnduff is born in 1886, a year of particularly intense sectarian rioting in Belfast, and he's raised in Sandy Row, as you can see on the right here, around about that time. He's educated then at the Hibernian School in Dublin from about 1896 until the turn of the century. He's in a gang, the Pass clan, which he writes about later, and his mother's from the south, Newbridge, County Kildare, and his schoolmaster Presbyterian father is from the north, Drumbo, County Down. And of course, he signs, like most Protestant males of his generation, the Ulster Covenant in September 1912. The following year, he's back at the shipyard as a helper and driller, because he's a labourer at a very young age, of course, as well. But then he joins the Royal Engineers and enlists to fight in the First World War, with some of his memories crystallizing into later poems, including about Ypres and Mézines. He becomes a member of the Young Citizens Volunteers, which was an independent group that amalgamates into the original mass movement of the Ulster Volunteer Force. And he describes in his autobiography being involved with gun running during the Home Rule crisis. And he's around a lot of the murkier activities that are going on at this time. He could tell lurid stories of basements and attics packed with rifles in exclusive Belfast suburbs. In 1919, he's demobbed and returns home to the shipyard where he was working when the violence of the 1920s erupted. You have to remember that over 500 people are killed in Belfast between 1920 and 1922, and especially around the shipyard expulsions of July 1920, which occurred in Holland and Wolf Shipyard, and Workman Clark's Wee Yard, where Carnduff worked. And though Carnduff's own recollection of this hasn't survived, it was actually reported that Carnduff personally helped Catholic workers escape over the River Lagan to safety when mobs of workers roamed menacingly through the shipyards, assaulting Catholic employees and also so-called rotten prods, that is, Labour supporting Protestants. Now, what's interesting is that Northern Ireland comes into existence in 1921. As I said, the centenary is being marked with this, and Carnduff spends almost 4 years serving the Ulster Special Constabulary's Northwest Brigade before returning to the shipyard again in the mid-1920s. But remember that when Workman Clark's collapses in the early 1930s, following the Great Slump, around 8,000 workers from it are put out of work. And this is the other essential detail of Carnduff's life I wanted to emphasize today: the consistency of unemployment, the feeling and the experience of being poor, hungry, precariously employed, and struggling to make ends meet. This concept of being working class and trying to work and write your way out of it. And this class aspect to his identity is essential, and it's all these layers, contradictions, and complexities that make Carnduff interesting, and I think is the reason why I'd argued he'd make a great symbol of Northern Ireland on its centenary. Of course, whether the NIO and the authorities want to hear these complexities is something else, but you have to say there's something for everyone in Carnduff. And what emerges most for me from Carnduff is the working class outsider nature that he has, and also his dedication towards advancing the arts and literature. The simple belief that these make our world better, and it runs through so much of his letters, writing, and lived experience. So there's this baseline of the initial shipyard experience that characterizes his early poems, and he writes to the poet laureate at the time, John Masefield, who wrote back to him from Boars Hill in Oxford. And he encourages Carnduff to write to me more stories of this life on the ships and in the yards. And many of these poems actually followed. So, there's the one in particular, though, which I wanted to highlight, which is called Men of Belfast, which some of you might have seen. And it's one that resonates because this is the poem which is viewed thousands of times a year at the Titanic Belfast exhibition by virtue of its being inscribed on the atrium floor in a compass. From the night of moving shadows to the sound of the shipyard horn, we hail thee, Queen of the Northland, we who are Belfast born. But once again, it's the class consciousness that resounds. In the Song of the Unemployed, Carnduff writes how we built your graceful structures from a heap of clay and stone. We fashioned out of nothing yonder proud and stately dome. The steeples rising skywards bear the hallmark of our skill, and the hands that shaped your mansions have the cunning in them still. Now, I'm going to back up a bit to 1930 when Carnduff makes an address to the Belfast YMCA Literary and Debating Society in November of that year. This is about 2 years before he really makes it as a writer, when his first play is put on at the Abbey Theatre. And he says at this meeting, I like to sing about the shipyard workers because nobody else does. And he talks, even at this relatively early stage, how poetry and art were not the privilege of the upper classes. The workers needed beauty and art and better literature as an inspiration to rise and seek more beautiful surroundings. Politics were all right in their way, but they didn't inspire a man as poetry and art did. There's always this dedication to the workers and laborers in his writing. Although he'd already begun to write verse and had a collection published, It was the production of Workers, his first full-length play at the Abbey Theatre in October 1932, that really launched Carnduff as a writer. You can't emphasize again how important this was. For a play about workers and struggles with unemployment to appear on the stage of the National Theatre of Ireland was quite an achievement. And I think it just adds a further Irish layer to Carnduff's complicated identity. Just before Workers opened in the Abbey, a journalist from the Irish Independent met Carnduff and captured him as follows. I wanted to share this with people. So this is how he's described. Stereotyper on the defunct Ulster Echo, labourer on the Queen's Island, soldier in the Great War, and back again to that labouring job in the shipyards, and then dismissal, weary years on the dole. He got tired of it and had the cheek to open an office with a typewriter and advertise typing and copying done here, or words to that effect. He's still running that little business and just making enough to substitute butter for margarine on the family loaf. 1 wife and 4 kiddies. And in the long gaps between the customers, he wrote this play, red hot with his memories of the shipyard and raw with his starkly honest vision of its humanity. He talked to me of this play with a queer, phlegmatic earnestness. It is drama, he said, just drama, the life of the shipyards and the people of the shipyards as I have lived it. And before the play started, there's a nice story where there was a rendition of Amron Navin, a soldier's song, the Irish national anthem, which was played as was customary, and Carnduff felt obliged to stand, though he joked later that he hummed the Boyne Water under his breath to mark it in his own special way. And what followed was Workers was essentially a triumph and was cheered by the Dublin audience, who called him to the stage with insistent cries of author, author. And when he got up, he said to the audience what a proud moment it was for a Belfast working man like myself to have shown in a theatre with the tradition of the Abbey some of the heroism and humanity of the men whom he has worked with all his life is a great thing. Tonight you have lifted one of the workers of Belfast a little higher than he has ever been before. And years later, Carnduff exalted again how years of poverty, misery, disappointment were forgotten in that solitary moment of heaven. I, an unemployed shipyardman, became a playwright. And I think it's details like this that led Carnduff to refer to the essential unity of the Irish people, which accounted for his positive reception on the Abbey stage, and his view that is always expressed that literature in Ireland has no border. And 3 further plays followed, Traders, Machinery, and Castlereagh. And again, some of those have been lost and we don't actually survive, sadly, though perhaps one day they might emerge from someone's attic or something like that. But they're all enthusiastically received in Dublin and Belfast. I want to say more now about Carnduff's associations with the independent Orange Order, as Carnduff is also important to us today because he was an Orangeman who saw the tradition in its Irish context. And I think it's kind of interesting because there's a lot of work that the Irish government's doing to try and sort of reach out to Orangism. And again, I think it's interesting and important to define that Carnduff's always defensive of Orangism. And as a man with generations of family connections, the order is in his blood, even if he was also fully aware that the landowning class and gentry sensed the possibilities of exploiting as quote, the organization as a first line of defense for their own particular interests. So Carnduff joined the independent Orange Order in his teens, causing what he called a bit of a family row with his brothers who were members of the main institution. And there's a nice little divide within a very Protestant family there. And the IOO flourished from 1903 to 1908 under Lindsay Crawford and Thomas Sloan. And an active following actually still persists in North Antrim. And indeed, the late Reverend Ian Paisley was a high-profile member of the Independent Orange. And actually, what's interesting is recent research from scholars like Peter Murray, who showed how radical the Independent Orange Order actually was in challenging both Protestant and Catholic Church hierarchies. So in other words, while it was about defending Protestant values, Sloan actually clashed with Protestant church authorities as well as the Catholic Church. And there's a radical anti-authority dimension to this offshoot, which is often forgotten about. So I did a bit of digging in the newspapers on this and found an article which I don't think has been credited before in the Belfast newsletter that placed Carnduff with the Independent Orange at a field at Malone in 1928. So what are the Independent Orange talking about here? Remember, this is 7 years into the existence of Northern Ireland. A man named Brother John Wallace, County Grand Master, presides and said that they hoped to take a prominent and fearless part in the shaping of the future destiny of Ulster. They stood for Protestant and democratic principles, of course, and resolutions to this effect were passed calling for Sabbath observance and so on. But also, interestingly, Brother James Doherty, who was Imperial Grand Secretary of this gathering, also expressed the view that the receipt of unemployment benefit was nothing compared to actually gaining a job. So he's talking about employment here and actually labourers in Ulster being given work. He also condemned, this is Doherty, condemned the decontrol of houses over £26 valuation. And he also interestingly denounced the domination of any political party in the Orange institution. And you have to note that last point, the condemnation of Orangism being associated and entwined with one political party, as the Unionist Party was with the main Orange institution until very recently. And Doherty goes on to say that a real attempt must be made to deal with the unemployment problem. Political shibboleths and perfervid denunciation of socialism awoke no response from the man in the street who wanted a job. They had heard of a country fit for heroes to live in, but just now it was only a hero who could get a living in it. And there's a great line in the article towards the end, the political Micawbers who were waiting for something to turn up must get a move on. And then Carnduff is actually named in this article, which, as I said, I don't think has been seen or highlighted before, as having spoken at this gathering after Wallace and Doherty. Firstly, I love the phrase political Micawbers, and I hope that's due for a revival sometime, because I think we have a number of political Micawbers around right now. And also think about those elements that are being discussed there. Unemployment, work, moving away from one party association with the Orange. You can see real political dissent there. It's interesting because writing in the Irish press, which you have to remember is De Valera's newspaper, Dev's newspaper, in 1966, a man called Lewis Gilbert recalls Sandy Row as an area and Carnduff, and he said that Carnduff never missed the 12th of July and walking in the field. But I was unable to discover whether he believed in the teachings of the order or whether he was carried away by the gay atmosphere of carnival that surrounded the annual demonstration. He often told me that the 12th was part of the way of life, that he had a great affection for it. But his play, Castlereagh, proved that he had the same high regard for 1798. So I suppose that was fair enough. I think that's a nice segue into Carnduff's other historical preoccupation, which is also represented on the slide here, which is the era of 1798. And his play, as Gilbert mentioned, on Lord Castlereagh, played in both Dublin and Belfast in 1935. And one of the things that comes through most in this play is not Castlereagh himself, but actually the character of James Jemmy Hope Weaver Temple Patrick, who you can see on the right here of this slide, the most progressive of the United Irishmen, who is really the hero of this play and who this play is really about. And you discover when you read through the text that there's a subversive quality here, with Carnduff using the figure of Castlereagh to introduce audiences to the socialist ideals of Jemmy Hope. And it's the sort of thing of, lots of people rock up to the play expecting to see something about Castlereagh, and instead most of the play is given over to Jemmy Hope and his speeches and this class consciousness, which precedes some of the debates in later times. And in his own article for the Irish Press in 1935, Carnduff explained how the rebellion was crushed. Henry Jory McCracken, along with a number of the leaders, was executed in his native town within sight of his own home. Jimmy Hope, though hunted from pillar to post, managed to escape a like fate and died in the town at a ripe old age. The old rebel strongholds of those days are now citadels of unionism, yet no true Ulsterman is ashamed to own that his ancestor had once taken up arms for what were then the principles of liberty. And again, what's interesting is Carnduff often returns to 1798 in his journalism and is always rekindling that episode, and especially the figure of Jemmy Hope. Now, there's one other story I have to mention in regard to this and following from these associations, which is the story here about Peter O'Donnell, who was the Donegal-born writer and Irish Republican. There's a famous tale of O'Donnell where he was on leave from the Curragh prison camp, taking the journey home to West Donegal, and he stops in Belfast to meet Carnduff. And Carnduff in turn used to visit O'Donnell's Dublin house and once presented him with an orange sash, which O'Donnell placed in a glass case and apparently proudly exhibited. So you have this extraordinary moment, which could only happen in Ireland, where a Republican socialist icon and an Orangeman have this existential encounter where there's not just peace and coexistence, there's also respect and even a level of affection. And if they can manage this recognition, they can manage this warmth, despite their differing politics, so could anyone. And O'Donnell remembered that Carnduff gave him the sash shortly before he died. And he remarked shortly after Carnduff died that of all the things I treasure the most in the world, that is the one I value most. Best of all, when presented with the sash, O'Donnell joked, "This is the one time that an Orangeman's handshake is better than a papal blessing," which is a pretty immortal line on any lines. And after Carnduff died, O'Donnell actually visited the Young Ulster Society and paid tribute to Carnduff as one of the great influences in the cultural life of Ireland. The kindling of intellectual life in Belfast had now reached the stage, he said, that when it got that little bit further, it would become a flame and would not be put out. Belfast was due for a great burst of writing and of activity in the theatre. O'Donnell said, writing in Belfast is different from writing in Dublin. People in Dublin are provoked to write by reading, but in Belfast, one feels they are provoked to write by life. Alas, the flames that arrived by the late 1960s were actually very real, but there's also truth in that statement that great drama and writing would abound in Northern Ireland from this time too. So one of the final things I wanted to talk about today was Carnduff's role played in a civic sense. What John Gray, who with Sarah Ferris has done so much to keep Carnduff's work and name alive, calls Carnduff's value as a social and cultural commentator. And we have to consider how Carnduff sees himself as a proponent for culture, literature, and drama in and from Northern Ireland. Remember, the state is only 14 years old when Carnduff founds the Young Ulster Society in 1935, whose explicit aim was to spread an appreciation of the arts without any political or sectarian bias. And in his address to it in 1938, Carnduff was reported as speaking critically of higher education in Northern Ireland, as he argued that universities were the builders of a community's ideals. And he questioned what influence had Queen's on that community, Queen's University Belfast. Hundreds of students who left that university, many with high honours every year, seemed to disappear into oblivion. Doctors, clergymen, engineers, lawyers became cramped in their professions, just as the workers became cramped in their industry surroundings. Their individuality passed out as professionalism enters in, and the culture, art, and literature of the people lost inspiration. I thought that was a fascinating insight, a very intelligent insight from Carnduff, but also critical in what he was looking on in terms of Northern Irish society. I think it's quite a bold statement to make in late 1930s Northern Ireland. It seems to me there that Carnduff is requesting that universities take responsibility for the societies they operate in and asking for leadership. You know, it's not just that thing of what you can get out of a career, but what you can do with a society and building to make somewhere better. He's pushing an envelope here, I think, in a way that few dared or tried, and he's aware it goes both ways, as he also criticizes the artistic snobbishness, was his phrase, in what was then the Irish Free State too. When you look back on the Young Ulster Society's activities, it's clear Carnduff was actually trying to stimulate a conversation, not just about the appreciation of the arts, but also this education. So some of its speakers, such as the novelist F.L. Green and Richard Rowley, were quite high-powered and gave talks that evidently challenged the cohort. Michael McClavity, the writer, and painter William Connor are introduced as vice presidents in 1939. And Carnduff selects speakers carefully for this thing, sometimes to highlight a discussion that needed to be had, perhaps because it was absent from what was going on. And sometimes that interacted powerfully with history. So he recalls the Czech foreign minister, Jan Masaryk, on the left in the slide here, visiting Belfast in December 1942, about halfway through the Second World War, when Carnduff was quite a sardonic air warden for the civil defence, to speak at a PEN function in Belfast's Union Hotel. PEN is an organisation of writers in an international sense. And in a typically acid letter to his wife, Mary, he described the event as crowded with third-rate writers and a host of non-writers, as well as blousy, flocked, and uninteresting old ladies who seemed to be in the majority. Carnduff felt that he was in the presence of a really magnetic historical figure, but criticized this local audience who failed to shine, even when the Czech leader rose to inspiring heights when portraying the persecution of the Czechs and the Jews. Masaryk appealed to the Belfast PEN to help on the restoration of European culture after the war. It was like appealing to the ocean to cultivate apples, was Carnduff's, again, quite cheeky phrase. And those letters are a great resource for people for these sort of sharp cultural and comments and asides. And I think this episode also shows how Carnduff had a genuine international consciousness, which was also shown in what he reads at the time. And he contrasts it with that local well-heeled cultural establishment in Belfast that is just not at the races for this. So I'd like to start by bringing this to a close by reminding people of the eternal money and economic worries Carnduff lived through and how he registers most in present times. He never came close enough, not even remotely, to being able to own his own home, calculating in one of his more affluent spells that after rents and tax, he had about 30 shillings to swim the channel with. Changing accommodation regularly, he once rented a home in a road opposite Skegneel Avenue, North Belfast, writing to his wife Mary how it was, quote, not a safe area. I want you to be in a safe area. And Mary in turn remembered that though he lived among working people all his life, he never failed to see the drabness of it, as in the grind of poverty, how it breaks you down. As he says in his poem Poverty Street, nights are drear in Poverty Street, drear and lone. Scarcely a shadow you chance to meet, except your own. What Carnduff did build was cultural, and he constantly fantasized, if he ever came into any money, of building a little theatre for Belfast to see if we might manage a centre like the Abbey Theatre, where some sort of academy could be formed to give recognition to artists, writers, and similar workers. And at the same time, he's always thinking about how Northern Ireland, and especially Ulster people, present and represent themselves. So in a 1939 talk, he said that the stage Ulsterman should follow the stage Irishman into oblivion. Lands, wills, cash, and big drums were not a fair characterization of the Ulsterman's ideals. And it strikes me that this debilitating stereotypes of Ulster Protestantism that so many of us have encountered and challenged over the years and in recent times was another theme that Carnduff was onto all those years ago. So a final coda to Carnduff's life. In 1977, the Belfast Telegraph reported that the Young Ulster Society continued its activities for some years after Carnduff's death, but interest gradually petered out and the society has not been active for years. Its committee still exists, however, and they still have some money in the bank. So it has been decided that they will use it to buy 2 mahogany chairs for the Linen Hall Library, where Carnduff spent the last few years of his life as caretaker. It was incidentally the first secure job he had ever held, and it could scarcely have been a more appropriate one. That was the description of the original article. And apparently the 2 chairs were presented to the library in the following week, and perhaps Jason can identify those sometime. Now, I think it tells you of the ultimate working class quality of Carnduff's life, that his last job when he was an elderly man was his most secure. And the precariousness of employment remains one of the abiding universal themes of our world. The exploitation of workers through iniquitous schemes like zero-hour contracts, updated and enacted by conservative governments across the globe, rolling back some of the gains made since Carnduff's time. Carnduff's struggles truly are our struggles. He never had money, but he never stopped trying to lift people's spirits through ordinary life, lived through the written word, with a smile on his face, a glint in the eye, and that razor sharp pen always. So I'll end with Carnduff's own words now, which I think are a good way for me to give way to the society which is going to follow here. He said, "The history of our province has been a glorious tragedy. The streets of this great city of ours are full of incident and realism and life. Our people are seeking expression for their ideals and aspirations. Don't stifle their ambition, encourage it." I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Connal. That was really excellent. And I'm sure the rest of the audience enjoyed it also. There are a couple of questions, but I'm going to give you a breather first. And I'm going to ask, first of all, if Chris Stackerbury from the Society could unmute himself, start his video. And if you could, Chris, just begin by saying something about the Thomas Carnduff Society before you begin your contribution, please. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
You can indeed.
Good evening, folks. Just an insight into the Thomas Carnduff Society. Firstly, I came in contact with Thomas Carnduff's work about 5 years ago. It was got down to it. It was on a day off work, and I was just amazed by the story of the man, you know, and especially his Dublin connection. Myself being a Dublin man, and his Orange connection, especially the independent Orange Order, and like what Connal spoke on there about the independence within that thinking framework within the independent Orange Order. And I was speaking to a friend, an Orange historian, David Jamison, sorry. He's from Sandy Row, and he highlighted just there last week that the independent Orange Order was nearly every lodge in Sandy Row at one time, you know. So it just gives you an insight into that working class thinking within Protestantism and within the Orange Order. So when we were thinking about the Thomas Carnduff Society, I approached Bino and William Ennis at the time, and Connal. And we were saying, listen, you know, what can we do to reflect within East Belfast the written word, or to encourage living experience, and from writers who wouldn't normally be on the circuit. You know, there's a circuit everywhere, a circuit at Limerick, Galway, writers circuit, people with confidence who go to open mics, who get their poems into journals. But there's also the other side of that. There's people who don't do that but like to write. So that's where the Yard Sessions is born out of, to give a free platform for those people who wish to attend from the local community and express their work, or to listen, or to read something they like. And we had one experience there, one lady who attended 3 sessions from September, October, November, and she used to come up and she'd say, "Chris, I'm not really going to read, I just came here to listen." And then in December, she found a piece about the strike and about the riot on the Newton Arch Road. And she was so passionately moved by this because it evoked memory of her grandfather relating a story. And she went up and she read that. And I said, well, that's a success for me, you know, for the society. So that's where we're coming from. Now, at the moment, we're looking at trying to get a framework on the society and to have a formally registered, that we can then take it a step forward and hopefully run a literature festival in East Belfast.
Thanks, Chris. Just to say, I've had a message there from Robert to say that his device isn't allowing him onto the session, so he won't be able to join us. Okay. What I wanted to do maybe is just to hand over to, is that your contribution finished, Chris? Just
it is indeed, yes. Yeah.
No problem. I didn't want to cut you up there. I just want to hand over to Gaynor Kane, who I think is hopefully on the call. If she could unmute herself, start her video, and give us her contribution, if she would. Okay, maybe Gaynor's not there as well. Is Karen amongst us? Karen is the 4th contributor that I have down here. Karen, if you could unmute yourself and start your video. No, we seem to have lost. Oh, well, we got you.
There's Gaynor.
Gaynor. Bear with us, folks. It's always a way with these things.
Hi, sorry.
You're okay. Okay.
Hi, I wasn't actually aware that I was contributing, but I'm very happy to. I attended a number of the sessions in the Site Visitors Centre and always find it a really welcoming night. Chris and William and Bino created a really inviting platform for people to come along and make new acquaintances and find friendship there. Would you like me to read a poem of mine, or?
Yeah, why not? You're here now.
So my dad was an apprentice carpenter in the shipyard, and it might be appropriate then to read a poem about his time in the yard. And I'll just find the page. So this is about when the Canberra was being built. Job number 1621. Once a carpenter on the Canberra, now rheumatoid anchored aground for years. You got thrown off after a week, you said, caught having tea and a fag. Shipped to a tanker, as your own boss, you skipped off early on Fridays to smooth talk girls and dance. I asked what you'd crafted. You rubbed your face buying time, white cheeks veined in seaweed purple with barnacle knuckles. I offered suggestions, a mahogany cabinet with dovetails, an oak bar carved with scrolls, acorns, leaves. No, you laughed. The porthole edgings. Terms googled, King's Stud appeared. I pictured you Elvis-like, easy come, easy go, your Tony Curtis curl now white shook. You said you had trimmed them with cripples. Thank you.
Thank you, Gaynor. That was lovely. What I might do now is just finish them with a couple of questions for Connal, if I may. One did come through in the chat, but I'm going to kick off with one of my own. And again, if anybody has any other questions, do stick them in the chat function. The question that I have for you, Connal, is whenever you wrote that article for the newsletter, I followed some of the comments on Twitter. And I mean, Carnduff was attacked really and written off on the basis of being an orange man, and people didn't seem to be able to see past that. What I want to ask you is, how do we, as a society, get past that? How do we kind of break down that barrier of people like Carnduff and even today, people being written off purely on the basis of, for example, their membership of the Orange institution?
It's a good question, Jason. Thanks for that, and it's good observation as well. And I suppose that there's always a level of that kind of political attack that's going to come and be invited whenever Orangism is mentioned. And I can understand that, but what I thought was a bit sad about that in certain ways was that Carnduff is, the whole point about what I was saying was that Carnduff is such an interesting figure because he is also Irish. He is also someone who's born in pre-partition Ireland, and you know the play going on at the Abbey, and he's always comfortable in his Irishness. You know, he doesn't make any kind of bones about it. And I thought it was sad to see that kind of then accompany just the mere mention of him. And I think that it's something that I've addressed for a long time, which is how not just Orangism, but also probably also Protestantism more generally gets disparaged as being something, a group, a unit which lacks a culture, which lacks a literary imagination, that lacks a heritage, and this sort of poetic talent and its ability to be involved in literature. And it's not true. It's not a factual thing. It's not something which is which has any evidence to back it up. It is a purely political attack. And the irony of it is that when people talk about Northern Ireland and potential unity, there are these kind of outreach things towards the Orange Order, and people in whatever island emerges down the line will have to take this on board, because this is something which means a lot, Orangism and the order to a lot of people. And again, it's missing this sort of, even the difference within Orangism with the independent Orange, which Chris mentioned there as well. It was good to hear him pick up on that. I think the thing we can do, though, specifically to answer your question, is that we can just keep on trying to highlight the more positive stories that exist around and show it is a kind of rich culture. It is a rich, interesting kind of history there. And it's complicated and it's interesting. It's not straightforward. And I think we're still in this kind of cultural battleground in Northern Ireland looking ahead. And so people miss that. They miss the nuance and they miss the complexity of that history, which is a shame, because it's something which should actually be embraced.
Next question is from Mark Doherty, who asks, really, do you have any recommended reading on Carnduff's life and his poetry?
So I think the most important thing to get a hold of is the edited Carnduff collection, which John Gray, who was also associated with the Linen Hall, and as I said in the talk, that a lot of really important work in keeping Carnduff's name alive. You get his autobiography, Mark. It has sort of sketches of his of a memoir. It's not complete, but it's there's quite a lot of it there, and that's a good read, which is a good place to start. But obviously his two collections as well of poetry, particularly the Out of Works, and then also the Songs of an Out of Work, and then also Poverty Street, which was a later publication bringing together some of his poems. But I think that people like John Gray and Sarah Ferris did a lot to keep Carnduff's work alive, and if you kind of get things by them. One other final reading recommendation is there's an article by a guy called Peter Murray in the SAO Journal, which is a Labour journal, which is about the independent Orange Order, and that was the article which kind of changed my mind actually about it. I know David Fitzpatrick does some work on the independent Orange as well, but that particular article, which is in the SAO Journal, I'd be very happy to mail that reference to anyone who would like to read up further on that.
Excellent. There's nothing else has come through there, Connal, so you're off the hook for now. But just one thing left. It was that Chris did send through a message to say that he would like to finish with a poetic contribution. So if I could just ask Chris to unmute himself and just bring us to a close with his contribution. Thanks.
Hi there, folks. This piece I wrote when I lived in East Belfast. That's going back in 2016. And it's just called Band Hall. Shutter front pound can, blue bag, bodies deep, mass grave of side drums spill out from wall, the salient of illegal gatherers, no 11+1 required. Skinny girl clearing tables, giggling out the penny. Her boy burps out, a light shone in the night. Swaggering polyester uniforms cut the smoke, ashtrays, cheap beer, spray tan. Loyalist tunes, urban voice, but real. No surrender rained out of Jack's door. Pen and ink proclaim to educational disadvantage, political manipulation. No big houses in the inner east, only red, white, blue people. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. And with that, we'll bring the session to a close unless anybody has anything else that they need to say. There's nothing else that's come through in the chat, so I'm just going to end the meeting. But thanks very much. Thanks very much, everyone, for joining us. And please keep an eye out on the Linen Hall Library's website for some future online events coming up in the coming weeks and months. Take care.
Thank you.